Welcome back to the Cale Clark Show. It is so good to be with you on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and also on YouTube. And of course, I'm joined as always by producer Lucas Holt. We are cracking open. I'm going to crack open a Diet Coke right here. Crack open a brand new episode. Lucas is lame. He's only drinking water, but he's, you know what? That's actually a good thing. He's being penitential already because guess what, folks? We're going to be talking about Lent. Lent is upon us. Can you believe this? March the 5th, 2025 is Ash Wednesday already. And I actually love Lent, Lucas. It's one of my favorite seasons in the liturgical year, and I really can't wait to get into it. How about you?
Yeah, well, I have. Why is it one of your favorites? Just out of curiosity.
We'll get into this later on, but I kind of like the austerity of it a little bit. I like, because we need to do penance for many reasons, and we often talk about the negative mortifications we can do, like we don't do something, like we don't eat chocolate or we give up beer for Lent or something like that. But there are also positive mortifications that we can do. For example, if you don't like working out, that can be a mortification for you and has a side benefit of making you a lot healthier. So just things like that. It's kind of a way to set yourself right in a lot of ways and get more serious about our spiritual lives.
Well, you mentioned giving up beer, but I'm sure you've heard of the beer fast, right?
Yeah. Can you explain to the people about the beer fast a little bit?
So I only know a little bit about this, but I'm pretty sure there's a monk community, and I think it's in Germany. They do what's called a beer fast, and they just drink beer during Lent. And it must be something thick like Guinness that has high calorie, low alcohol content. But in a way, if you think about it, it sounds like, oh, that would be great. Drink beer for 40 days. But honestly, like, I bet you probably never day 3, you probably wouldn't want any more beer.
That's what I was going to say. You probably never want to have a beer again. But it's interesting because you mentioned Guinness, and my understanding of the history of Guinness, which is pretty rudimentary. I just tend to enjoy the beverage and not worry too much about the backstory. But my understanding is that it was essentially created as a kind of meal replacement, if you will, during times of famine and things like that in Ireland. So at any rate, it's the beer that eats like a meal, I guess. And we could do a beer fast. That's an interesting option for sure. But I wanted to ask you this, Lucas. Do you know what the etymology of the word Lent is? Where do we get this word Lent? Do you know this? Is a bit of a quiz for you.
I actually do not know. I'm not sure.
Well, as it turns out, and I had to look this up myself as well, Lent is the Old English word for spring. How about that? For springtime.
Okay.
Now, in other languages, and I read a nice piece about this by Jimmy Akin, good friend of mine from Catholic Answers days. I used to write for their magazine and met Jimmy a couple times. He's a great guy. Yeah, he wrote a little piece about this, and he mentioned that in other languages of the world other than English, really what you have is Lent is called something else in each language, but it's kind of a derivative of the Latin term quadragesima, which means the 40 days. And so that's where we get that word Lent from. And here's another question about, and this is, I'm really putting you on the spot here, Lucas, but is Ash Wednesday, and of course Lent kicks off with Ash Wednesday, is Ash Wednesday a holy day of obligation for Catholics in the United States?
No, it is not.
You are correct. Yes. It's not in Canada either. A lot of people, I think a lot of casual Catholics think that it is, because almost everybody does go to Mass on Ash Wednesday. They may not realize that it's not a holy day of obligation, but I'm glad that they're coming. I think it's fantastic that they are going. And what's also interesting about that too is that if you're in a big city like New York City, you'll see, like if you go to St. Patrick's Cathedral, many non-Catholic Christians will come in, and even non-Christians, people from different faith backgrounds or of no faith at all, tend to show up at these Ash Wednesday masses because they want to receive the ashes. There's just something about it when the priest or the minister, perhaps the deacon, traces the sign of the cross on your forehead and says, remember that you are dust and unto dust you shall return, repent and believe in the gospel. There's just something about that from dust you've come, and to dust you will return. That it just kind of strikes a chord with the human soul, and I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember like before I became Catholic, like I honestly didn't really know anything about Ash Wednesday, at least
Hmm.
in the Protestant denomination that I was familiar with. It's actually funny. I don't know if I've told you this story, Kale, but I remember this is when I just became Christian, not Catholic yet, and
Hmm.
I was doing an internship, and at my job there was this girl that I thought was cute, and I see her one day, and I'm like, trying to figure out how I can make conversation with her, and I noticed she has this what I thought was dirt on her face, and I'm like, hey, you got you got dirt on your face. Do you know that you've like got something up there? And she's like, it's ashes. It's Ash Wednesday. I'm like, what? I felt so stupid.
You know,
But
I got to, but no, it's a human reaction. Hey, can it, it's like, hey, your fly's down. I'd rather someone tell me you've got something on your forehead. And of course, you've probably seen those very funny memes that come out on Ash Wednesday. Father's revenge if he puts like a gigantic cross on your forehead,
yeah,
or they do tend to get a little bit smudge-like and Rorschach-like, if you will, as things are moving so fast, and the shape of the cross. You try to be like one of the first people in line. You're going to get a good one, I think. But other than that, yeah, it can be kind
yeah.
of dicey. Well, here's another question for you, Lucas, about Lent. And I'm sorry that things didn't work out with the young lady, but I'm actually not sorry, because things worked out much better for you with your wife. So,
This
so
is true.
it's a great thing. It's a great thing. Is Lent actually 40 days long, Lucas?
Uh, I want to say no. I want to say no because I think that you don't count the Triduum, right?
Well, yeah, that's a good point too, because the most sacred season in the church's liturgical year is the Sacred Triduum, which starts on the evening of Holy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and of course the Vigil, which goes into Easter Sunday, the Easter Vigil on the Saturday evening. That's a church season unto itself. It's only 3 days long, but it's the holiest season of the year. But you are correct. That's not part of Lent. But Lent is not. You are also right in saying that Lent is not 40 days long. Runs from Ash Wednesday until, of course, that Holy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper. It's never 40 calendar days, and you can actually look it up. And kind of a sidebar note to this as well: a lot of people fight and argue about whether Sundays should be counted for
Oh yeah.
Lenten penances, Sundays during Lent. And I have a relative, I'm not going to say who it is, who is incredibly militant about this. Like, if this person gives up beer for Lent, they will not have a beer on a Sunday. They'll just say, that's cheating if you do. I have huge issues with that. That's not cheating, because Sunday, even during Lent, Sunday is always a Class A feast day. It's always a solemnity, because it's, of course, the feast of the resurrection of the Lord. Every Sunday is a mini Easter, no matter what time of year it actually is. So that's something. It's always a day for feasting. Always a day for feasting. So, and by the way, the other thing too is these mortifications, these voluntary mortifications, like giving up something for Lent. Those are completely voluntary. The church doesn't actually mandate that you do that. That's up to you. So if you, I mean, chacun son goût, as they say in French, hey, to each his own. If you want to keep it going on Sundays during Lent, there's no law against it, but you don't need to. That's what I would say about that.
Yeah, and it's the same for some feast days, right? Like I'm thinking of like the Feast of Saint Joseph. Well, I guess it depends where you live and what the bishops of that country say. But I feel like
That's,
for like solemnities, you
yeah.
can also it's also a day in which you do not have to.
Well, I think
I
you're
mean,
right.
you
I'm
just
thinking of,
right?
like, St. Patrick's Day is another good one, right? So St.
Yeah, yeah,
Joseph's would be a solemnity, the Feast of St. Joseph on March the 19th. And of course, St. Patrick's Day, everyone wants to know, hey, are we allowed to have green beer on St. Patrick's Day? Or maybe a shamrock shake, I don't know. But no,
yeah,
and most of the times the bishops do give dispensation from, fasting, for example, if it happens to fall on a Friday, maybe even, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's ever fallen on a Friday and bishops have given abstinence from the
yeah,
relief from the abstinence in terms of eating meat, so you can have that. I don't know what corned beef maybe on St. Patrick's
yeah,
Day. So I
yeah,
should
yeah.
know this. I'm Irish. So, anyways, okay. So that's a really good point. It's never actually 40 days long, and every Sunday, even in Lent, is a mini Easter, if you will. So, obviously, Lucas, as we know, the reason why Lent it's not an actual 40-day period, but the 40 days is symbolic, and it's for really really good reason. Because in salvation history, 40 days, classically speaking, is a length of time, and there are several times like this are narrated in the scriptures, periods of intense preparation. For example, Moses on the mountain of God in the book of Exodus for 40 days. You can read about that in Exodus 24, Exodus 34 as well. The Israelite spies, go into the promised land for how long? 40 days. Then, of course, the prophet Elijah takes a journey. And how long do you think that was? I'll give you three guesses: 40 days before he receives this vision. And you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 19. Another classic example from the book of Jonah, the city of Nineveh has 40 days to repent or else it will be overthrown. And you and I had a great study on the book of Jonah for the Faith Explained show on Relevant Radio back in the day. Love that book. But of course, obviously the classic example, and this is one that is mentioned specifically by the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 540, it's Jesus in the wilderness in preparation for his public ministry as narrated in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 4, verse 2 is one place to look. Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness praying and fasting before he begins his ministry. And here's what the Catechism says, quote, "By the solemn 40 days of Lent, the Church unites herself each year to the mystery of Jesus in the desert," end of quote. So we have to, really the Catholic life is in so many ways an imitation of Christ. And this is where we imitate him in the desert, fasting, prayer, specific times of intense prayer, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's a really good salvation history image, the 40-day period that we're looking at as we get into Lent here, Lucas.
Yeah, and I think another one that's coming to mind is I think wasn't it 40 days and 40 nights that it rained in the book of Genesis with Noah and the flood.
So that's another great example.
Yep. So I'm curious what the 40 is symbolic of, like why that number, and why, like, because I feel like, with the number 7, it's supposed to symbolize this kind of totality, this fulfillment, this wholeness. 40 is an interesting one, and I don't know what that is supposed to mean.
Yeah, the 40 years wandering in the desert as well.
Yeah.
Well, we can Google it quickly, but of course the 40 days wandering in the wilderness too of the Israelites on their way to the promised land, need not have taken that long, but for disobedience. And yeah, it's just such a key image, obviously, and we can look at the number 40 in particular. And I did know the answer to that in the past, or at least an answer to that, but it doesn't come to mind immediately. But just one more housekeeping item for Lent, which a lot of people are somewhat confused about. What exactly does the church mean when the church talks about days of fasting and abstinence during Lent? Okay, let's talk about fasting first. So what exactly is a fast technically? It's a day on which Catholics who are 18 to 60 years of age, so once you turn 60, you're technically exempt from this. Although, if your health is good enough to do it and you have no medical issues with it and you want to do it, there's certainly nothing wrong with it. Catholics 18 to 60 years of age are required on a day of fasting to keep a limited fast. And what does that mean? It means the classic, you can have one meal, but you can also have two smaller snacks or two smaller meals that together do not add up to the size of the one large meal. And I know people try to cheat. The one large meal is ginormous, so the two small meals are pretty big too. When they don't add up to the larger meal, but they're still quite large. Okay, so obviously, don't try to cheat the system. Don't try to, look for loopholes here. So that's a day of fasting, and in Lent, technically speaking, the only 2 days that you actually have to do it are Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So eat that normal meal and have two snacks that in size do not add up to a second meal. Now, a day of abstinence, and some fast days are also days of abstinence. For example, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday are in this category as well. But a day of abstinence has nothing to do with abstinence from relations with one's spouse. If that's, I know a lot of people think about that when they hear the word abstinence, but it has nothing to do with that. This has to do with abstaining from eating meat. And a day of abstinence for Catholics starts at the age of 14. So all Catholics 14 years of age and up are required. And this never ends, even if you're past 60. If you're 99, 100 years old, you still have to do this. On a day of abstinence, 14 years of age until death, you are required to abstain from eating meat on those days. So obviously Ash Wednesday, Good Friday are days of both fasting and abstinence. So what's the deal with meat? Why do we have to abstain from eating meat? And for some people, that's not exactly a sacrifice. If you love salmon or if you love seafood, you might say, "Hey, man, that's not exactly a sacrifice for me." Maybe consider going vegan on those days. I don't know if you love. It's all about the spirit of it in so many ways. But traditionally, the reason why we abstain from meat on those days is because meat is traditionally associated with feasting, with joy. Think of the great wedding banquet scenes in Scripture, the return of the prodigal son, kill the fatted calf, let's have a party. And that's not exactly the ethos of Lent, of course, which is a little bit more penitential and sober in that sense. So, and fish, traditionally speaking, fish was not exactly, historically speaking, the meat was more rare in some ways. Lots of fishing to be had on the sea, on the shores of Galilee, of course. Peter and the guys, Zebedee and Sons Fishing Company, James and John, and their family businesses, if you will. Fish was a little bit more plentiful in those times, a little more common. You'd really pulling out the T-bone steaks was for a special occasion. So that's kind of the concept behind it, and hopefully that makes sense to people.
Yeah, and
How do you
just
feel,
curious
Lucas?
here, an Impossible Burger from Burger King. Does that where does that fall into the equation? No, I like what you said. I mean, it's about the spirit of it, right? And it's it's the sacrifice that we bring to it, the spiritual offering that we make with it that
Mm-hmm.
makes it truly significant. But it is interesting. It's almost kind of flipped. I feel like sometimes they honestly, I feel like it's a lot more affordable for me to get deli meat from Aldi than it is, for example, to buy eggs or something that's not meat,
Yeah.
But nevertheless, meat is obviously still good, and sometimes it's hard to just
Yeah, the
eat.
price of eggs is absolutely insane.
Yeah, but
Yeah, absolutely. The price of eggs, it would be almost an extravagant meal these days. Yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead. You're going to say something else.
but the fish. I do like the tradition that a lot of parishes have about having fish fries on Fridays as a way to like a community to get together um,
Yeah.
and kind of hey, we're all in this together and we're going to join together and not eat meat. So
Yeah, absolutely. Or Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah,
That's the meaning of it in French, Mardi Gras. Of course, the traditional pancake breakfast that happens sometimes in church events. Or is this happening on Sunday afternoon after the 12 noon mass? So it's it's a great way to build community as well, Lucas, as you said. I think that's really important. But I think right now I just want to shift gears a little bit into, now that we kind of got those practical questions out of the way. How can we make this Lent the best Lent of our lives? Because who knows, it might be the last Lent of our lives. So let's try to live this extremely well. How can we do that? Well, if you look at the readings for Ash Wednesday, this is the second reading. I'm going to just read a little bit of this here. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This is the second reading, Ash Wednesday Mass. Paul writes, "So we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We beg you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him," and that's Christ obviously, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Working together with him, then, we entreat you not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at the acceptable time I have listened to you and helped you on the day of salvation. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. So this idea of now, we don't want to put this off to some future time. Next year I'll focus better on Lent. It's a great chance on Ash Wednesday to make that fresh start if things have gotten a little bit stale in our spiritual lives. And great friend of the program, Cardinal Thomas Collins, he always says this: we're not angels. We're not angels. And you can say that again in more ways than one. Obviously, angels are pure spirits. We are men and women, body, soul, unity. And that's the way God wanted it to be, by the way. God always envisioned the human person as a body, soul, unity. That's why we're going to have resurrected bodies on the last day. And the theology of the body really plays into this in so many ways. But when he says, we're not angels, it's a little bit of a joke. But when you think about angels can't, one of the things that makes us different from the angels is that they cannot convert. They can't change their ways, if you will. They're outside of the realm of time. They're in eternity by nature. They're eternal creatures. They can obviously affect things in time and space. We all have a personal guardian angel. Think about that, of course. And there are bad angels too, devils, fallen angels like Satan and all his minions. And we can all remember old cartoons from our childhood where a character has an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, trying to either tempt us towards evil or to spur us on towards good. So, but we make decisions in time for good or for ill, for God or for sin or for self. But when the angels make a decision, it is really forever. It's an eternal decision. And so, traditionally speaking in Catholic theology, it's thought that the angels were given a choice from all eternity to adhere to God or not, to be loyal and faithful and serve God or not. And Satan, of course, who was known as Lucifer in heaven, a very powerful, beautiful angel. Some say he was the choir director of heaven, if you will, if you look at certain scriptures. And that's kind of interesting when you think about that, because music is often something that can draw the heart to God. Think about sacred music, or even secular Christian music. If you're listening to K-Love or something like that, that could draw the heart and mind to God. But then also, music can draw people towards sin. I mean, it can. So something to think about there. But these angels were all offered a choice to either worship God or essentially worship themselves. And Satan said, I will not serve, non serviam, if you will, and convinced a third of the angels to go with him in his rebellion. They were cast down from the heavens. And this is why it says in the book of Revelation that the tail of the dragon swept a third of the stars from the sky. And of course, the stars are symbolic of angels as well. So it's a definitive, irrevocable choice that the demons made against God and the other angels made for God. It's irrevocable. But we live in time, you and I, and we have the opportunity to repent, a time to convert. As Paul said in that reading, now is the acceptable time to convert. And God has given us a time to do so, a whole season to do so, the season of Lent, roughly 40 days, prayer, penitential practices, so that we can convert, become more configured to Christ. And St. Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, one of the things he used to say was this: sometimes we get too hung up on and I'm kind of paraphrasing him here, but we get too hung up on these big conversions in life. And some people that we know, obviously you converted to Catholicism, Lucas, and we've all heard of people who have had kind of splashy conversions. I recently heard of a former gang member named John Pridmore. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He was a big-time gang member in London. He used to carry brass knuckles in his pockets. He was kind of the muscle. Was involved in some pretty nasty stuff. And he has a conversion story. He was on one of those lighthouse talks called From Gangland to Promised Land. And sometimes we catch ourselves thinking, man, I wish I had a dramatic conversion story like that. But hey, I think just a great story of being faithful from baptism as a child until death is also pretty good too. Like maybe nothing
Yep.
flashy happens per se, but one of the things that Saint Jose Maria said was that after sort of a major conversion, and maybe we've always been Catholic, maybe we're cradle Catholics, but the most important conversions happen down the line, because the farther we go in life and the farther we go in the spiritual life, we have to make a conversion every day. We have to make little conversions and little choices for Christ every day. And sometimes those little conversions are actually more important in the sight of God, because they're more precious in the sight of God, because they cost us more. Because very often they happen at the level of the heart, where you have to consciously let go of something that you're really attached to, that's maybe keeping you from the next step in your spiritual life. And maybe nobody really sees that except for God, but it does cost you. And so I think that's something to really think about as we think about converting more and more to Christ this Lent, Luke.
Yeah, Kale, it's interesting. There's a few things that come to my mind as you were talking. First, just that passage from St. Paul where he says, "Now is the day of salvation," and it made me think of the conversation you recently had with Sahil Bloom, and
Mm,
how Sahil was talking about how we always say, "I'll
yeah,
do that later. I'll start this later," and really, it ends up being never. Later equals never. We just never get around to doing it. And I think, like, when we think about like
later
now is the
equals
day
never.
of salvation, like with Lent, we have this opportunity where it's like all those things that we put off. Now we have the opportunity to act on those. And you're talking about like smaller conversions. I mean, I'm just thinking to myself. So I used to be uh, a runner, and I ran cross country and track and stuff like that in high school and college. And I mean, I'm just thinking to myself, like, imagine if 40 days from now you were going to run a marathon. Like, no options. Like 40 days from now, you're required by whatever, you have to run a marathon.
Yeah,
You're going to want to do whatever you can to make sure that you are ready to go when it's race day. And sometimes that can be, you know, the big conversions of never running before to all of a sudden becoming a runner. But let's say, even if you are a runner, you still have to make those small tweaks in your diet. You have to make those tweaks in, maybe I'm going to start lifting weights now rather than just running. Maybe I'm going to change the way that how much fluids I intake every day. And maybe I'm going to go from running 3 miles a day to 3.5 miles a day. Those small changes that you make can pay dividends when it comes to race day. Like those things that don't seem like they make that big of a difference when it comes to
yeah,
game time, those subtle changes can
yeah,
be huge. I think it's the same in the spiritual life. Like maybe praying 5 minutes more a day, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But then 40 days from now, praying 5 more minutes a day, all of a sudden you formed these habits of the heart that all of a sudden you might not see it, but like there's this huge conversion that's taking place and God can work with that. So Lent is a
oh
beautiful
yeah,
time to make those small changes and allow God to work in your heart through that. And um, yeah, easier said than done. It does take discipline. But thankfully God is gracious and merciful and patient. So
yeah. You said so many great things there, and yes, the conversation I had with Sahil Bloom, his New York Times best-selling book. I had this conversation with him before the book came out, and now it is a New York Times bestseller. I think 3 weeks in a row. It's been at the number 2 spot. I think it was number 2 in all of Amazon as well recently. So if you missed my interview with Sahil Bloom, it is unmissable. You got to check this out. He's an amazing guy, and his book, The 5 Types of Wealth, is phenomenal. So go get yourself a copy for sure. And yeah, he talks about this concept of later equals never, and so it is important to do it now. And I think what you're saying is really good stuff for all. Like we talk about those little conversions. It's like being an athlete. You're already an athlete, and you're just trying to tweak things and make things even better, like you talked about. But I think it's also important that sort of the converse is also true for those who have been kind of spiritual couch potatoes up until this point. It's probably not smart to try to become a spiritual Olympian overnight and go from doing no spiritual practices to, I'll give you a great example. Uh, a friend of mine who works in a university setting with young Catholic students was saying that, he kind of gives some spiritual direction to these guys. And one of the students came to him and said, "Hey, I'm thinking of giving myself a really harsh penance for Lent." And my friend said, "What are you thinking? What are you thinking of doing?" And he said, "Well, I think I want to sleep on the floor, like just sleep on the ground, just sleep on the hard floor of my dorm room for Lent, just like the desert fathers of old." And and my friend said to him, "Well, can I ask you a question?" He said, "Sure. Is your dorm room actually clean? Is your desk organized? Are your papers a place for everything and everything in its place?" And he's like, "No, it's a disaster." Well, maybe start with that. Before you start
Yeah,
sleeping on the hard ground and using a rock as a pillow, try cleaning your room. And I think so. It's important because I think we could try to we can get really discouraged in the spiritual life
hmm,
if we try to go from 0 to 60 or try to go from 0 to 100, and we're not going to be able to do that. Just like you can't get up off the couch and run the New York City Marathon. You need to train and you need to build yourself up gradually. And that's why I think the practice of
yeah,
spiritual
that's a
direction is
really good
also
point.
really, really important in the spiritual life. If you don't have a director, if you don't have a coach, it's like having a coach in the spiritual life. And just like runners have coaches, golfers have coaches. It's great to have a coach in the spiritual life as well. And so I think that's well said. It's really, really important. So as we look at that too, the idea of making little changes, and for those of us who are practicing Catholics, so we're trying to practice even better, this idea of little conversions at the level of the heart are really important, because most of us have repented for sort of the big ticket item sins in our lives, like the great mortal sins we may have committed in the past. And of course, these are deadly sins. These are grave sins that kill the life of God in the soul. The French word "mort" means death. So really, we get it back through confession. If we commit these sins post baptism, and from time to time, we may fall into these things and have to go back to confession. But sometimes we kind of get over these big ticket sins, and we sometimes forget how much the little things also matter, and sins that we might say, "Oh, they're just venial sins, it's not a big deal." They really are a big deal, because they hurt the heart of Jesus. And the closer you get to Christ, the more you want to fall in love with Christ. You don't want to hurt the beloved. Just as I don't want to hurt my wife, I certainly don't want to hurt our Lord either, because we love him. And so St. Augustine said, you've got to really take care of these venial sins in your life too. And he said, think of it this way: you could be thrown to the lions, as the Christians were in the Colosseum, saints like Ignatius of Antioch, and a lion can tear your throat out and kill you in an instant. That's mortal sin. But you can also be thrown into a pit that's full of gnats and flies and little tiny creatures that just bite you over and over again. And each wound looks kind of tiny, but the cumulative effect can still kill you. Maybe not as quickly as a lion's bite. But he basically said this: if your sins don't give you pause because of their weight, i.e., they're not those heavy, grave, mortal sins, may you shudder, and may it really give you the chills when you think about their sheer number. Talking about the sheer number of venial sins, these small creatures can really destroy us as well. And so, how do we defeat these little sins? We defeat them through little penances and little mortifications, and that's really, really important. And this is really what Lent is all about, in a certain sense, because we're always trying to imitate Christ. We're always trying to be little Christ. That's what the word Christian means. But during Lent, we're specifically trying to imitate Jesus in a certain part of his life. And we talked about his desert experience as well, prayer and fasting. That's part of it that we try to imitate in particular, but also the part of his life known as his passion. And we talked about the Triduum season, which is really short, but it's an incredibly important season. That's when our salvation was accomplished. And this is really what happens in Lent as well. We're kind of trying to share more deeply in the passion of the Christ. Little nod to Mel Gibson there. I'm not trying to quote the movie title, but so that we might also share in the glory of his resurrection, his resurrected life. By the way, I think he's doing a movie on the resurrection too. I don't know when that's coming out. But St. Paul puts it this way: what he's writing to the Corinthians. He says this: we are always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. That's an important passage. That's from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Great chapter. The whole thing is amazing. But that's really sort of the root of our Lenten, our traditional Lenten practices of having a greater focus on prayer, penance, and mortification. Number 3, fasting, and number 4, almsgiving. It's trying to live in union with Jesus' passion a little bit more in those ways. And Lucas, I just want to unpack those a little bit one by one, because those are the 4 big ticket items I think we need to really um, hone in on during Lent. So let's talk about prayer for a minute. And we talked about Ash Wednesday earlier, and the ashes remind us that we are dust, and unto dust we shall return. The world that we're living in right now, although God, of course, loves the world, not he doesn't love worldliness. That's a totally different thing. But he loves the creation that he has created. But this world is not definitive. It will be transformed. Scripture talks about a new heaven and a new earth. In the eschaton, talks about that. After the resurrection, there's going to be a transformation of all creation, including our very bodies. So the state that we're in now is not definitive. So the happiness that we have, anything good in this world that we have in this life, even if it's a good from God, is not fully definitive. So only really what's in that future world is eternal. So we have to purify ourselves of things in this world that are ignoble. So, for example, say an inordinate desire for fame, and really, I think in many ways that's what's driving the social media mania that we have in our culture, an abuse of social media, or I don't know if you've heard of this book. It's kind of the book of the year that everybody's talking about, by Jonathan Haidt, called "The Anxious Generation." It's all about how this new generation of children are growing up with smartphones. We didn't growing up, and it's just transforming the way they see the world and their lives, and sometimes in not so positive ways. And I think this constant posting, it can really kind of lead to a form of narcissism. And really, it's kind of a desire for fame. It's a desire to live eternally. I don't want anybody to forget me. I don't want people to know or forget that I'm here. Can you see me? Well, God sees us, of course. But Lucas, where the ashes come from that we use, of course, on Ash
The
Wednesday. Tell everyone where they come
the
from.
palm branches from
I know
Palm
you know the
Sunday.
answer to this question. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really amazing, because Jesus was never more popular from a human point of view than on Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday, because he's coming into town riding on a donkey. And it makes me think of that great poem by G.K. Chesterton, The Donkey. It's an amazing poem. I'll look it up. Great poem for that day when it comes around. But on Palm Sunday, Jesus is a hero, and we know what happens just a few hours later. He is entering his passion. He goes to the cross, and those palms, of course, we use on Palm Sunday to greet the Lord. They are burned and used for the ashes on the next Ash Wednesday. And Father Tim Grumbach said this. It's a great line. He said this: the world can keep its earthly desire for power and fame. We will burn that desire and wear it on our faces, because we are made for so much more. End of quote. And I really like that quote from Father Tim Grumbach, this idea that it's kind of like this worldly fame and being thought well of, is not does not necessarily mean that we're pleasing to God. And so, anyways, we're looking for the applause of one, God alone. And so this is really, really important. And this is what prayer connects us to, this unseen future permanent world where the eternal things. And this is why the gospel reading for Ash Wednesday is taken from the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus talks about prayer, he talks about fasting, he talks about almsgiving. And he says, when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray in secret. And your Father who is in secret will reward you. Don't be like the hypocrites who like to make long prayers on street corners. And by the way, the word hypocrite simply means play actor. The Oscars are happening the Sunday before Lent starts, and lots of play actors will be rewarded. Maybe Timothy Chalamet will be best actor this year. Who knows? But you don't want to be a play actor in the Catholic life. And Jesus grew up very, very close to a big city. Nazareth was a small town for sure. Maybe 200 to 400 people lived there during Jesus' time. But just off the off ramp, very close to Nazareth, not too far of a walk, is the big city of Sepphoris. And tradition says that's where the Virgin Mary hailed from. That's where she grew up. And it was a very large city, one of the big three cities of the area, along with Caesarea Maritima, Caesar's by the Sea, as I like to call it. This is one of Herod's great projects. It was kind of like Vegas by the ocean, by the Mediterranean. It was something else. And then, of course, the other one was Tiberias. So Tiberias, Caesarea Maritima, and Sepphoris, they're all kind of connected by these great Roman highways, which really facilitated the spread of the gospel later on through the empire. But just down the road, just off the highway, was this big city of Sepphoris, and there was a great theater there. And some scholars suggest that perhaps Joseph and Jesus even got work there as tectons, as master craftsmen, and then maybe even helped build that theater. So this idea of play acting, a lot of people think Jesus got that from maybe hanging around, watching things unfold at the theater. And if you travel to the Holy Land, if you travel to Sepphoris, you can see this place even now. And so this idea of being a play actor, Jesus uses this to really identify insincere piety, where you're kind of playing to the crowd. You want other people to think you're pious and holy, but God is not fooled. And so this idea of making these long public prayers, it's like an actor on stage with a soliloquy. And so Jesus says, look, pray. There are times for public prayers. Of course, we worship together at Mass, but when you're making your prayers to the Lord, you have to be sincerely talking to him. Go into your room, shut the door, eliminate these outside distractions. So I think one thing we can do in Lent is try to make quality time with God, make our time with God quality. You wouldn't consider it quality time with your spouse if you're not in the same room with her face to face. I'll just text you, honey. We can talk over text, or I'll watch the game and maybe I'll talk to you on the phone while I'm doing that. I don't think she'd be impressed with that. And so that's one thing we can really do in Lent, is try to make our time with the Lord not only maybe a little bit longer in duration, but a little
Yeah.
bit more intense and personal, I think, Lucas.
Prayer is, it's all about, it's how we communicate with God. And the challenge is making the time for it. I think when it gets practical, it's like we have to be intentional about, like, okay, when am I going to do it? Is it going to be in the morning? Is it going to be in the afternoon? Is it going to be in the evening? It's going to be all three. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves and be like, if we know we're a morning person but not a night person, then try and make that time in the morning and figure out when is best for you to do that, and increase your chances at succeeding. Yeah, no, it's good.
Yeah, I think that's true. And St. Teresa of Avila said that in terms of the length, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking was St. Teresa of Avila is purported to have said that if someone prays for 15 minutes, in terms of mental prayer, 15 minutes a day, I'm not saying that this is the outer end, you can pray for longer, but if you pray for 15 minutes a day, she says, I'm confident that person will never be lost for all eternity. That's a pretty good guarantee from St. Teresa of Avila, if you will. All right, so let's talk about penance and mortifications. And this is an important aspect of Lent as well. And it's kind of a way of living with Christ on the cross, bringing the cross into our lives. Jesus says you have to pick up your cross daily if you want to follow me. And what he did for us, we have to do for others as well. We have to offer up penance for our own sins, not only that, and shortcomings, but we can do it for other people as well who are far from God. And that's what Jesus did on the cross, right? He made atonement for those who are far off in the future, who would be far from God, as perhaps we once were. So that's an important thing, but also it's a way of fighting against our own concupiscence, which is a fancy $5 theological word. It just simply means the after effects of original sin. After baptism, original sin is washed away, but the after effects still remain. This wounded human nature that it's always going to want to drag us down into sin that we have to fight against for the rest of our lives. And so this is the idea of these little mortifications. We have to kind of put to death that in us that wants to draw away from God. And really, we want to put all of our faculties and gifts and skills in order, under the order and direction of God and our own rational souls, if you will. We don't want these bodily passions to be controlling us, whatever they may be. Paul says, hey, for a lot of people, their God is the belly, to their shame. People walk around and say food for the stomach and the stomach for food. God gave me this thing. He wants me to use it. And he's not talking about eating, by the way. He's talking about something else. But he says, God will, you can say that. Food for the stomach and the stomach for food, but God will destroy them both. We have to bring all these passions under the control of Christ. So Paul says, when he's writing to the Colossians, he says this: put to death. There's the mortification aspect. Put to death, therefore, whatever is earthly in you: immorality, impurity, passions, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you once walked when you lived in them. In other words, a lot of you guys used to live this way before you met Christ. But now put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and foul talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his practices and have put on the new man, who is being renewed in knowledge after the image of his creator. That's from Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. So it's a little bit like, in terms of being renewed in the image of your creator, I always think of the Great Restoration project that happened at the Sistine Chapel. And there's been a lot of chatter about the Sistine Chapel lately, with Pope Francis not being in the greatest of health. We're praying for his recovery, of course. But he's not going to live forever. At some point, there will be a conclave to select a new pope. And the cardinals and Cardinal Collins used to talk about this because he was in the last conclave. He was made a cardinal by Pope Benedict, but he was part of the conclave that elected Francis. I have no idea who he voted for, and he wouldn't say, although some cardinals did leak things out of the conclave, which they ought not to do. It's a very, very serious faux pas and sin, if you will. But Cardinal Collins said, when you walk into the Sistine Chapel and you have to make this solemn vow that you will, with God as your witness and having to answer at the judgment bar of Almighty God one day of who you voted for, it's a pretty sobering reality. The last judgment scene by Michelangelo is there. It's like, So, but there's this big restoration project at the Vatican, in which like centuries of grime and soot and dirt that had covered these great mosaics, like the image of the creation of Adam, for example, were all kind of washed away painstakingly so the original could be seen in all its glory. And people were just wowed, like the vivid colors, like this was the artist's intent. And that's kind of what it's like with us. God had this dream for us, has this dream for us when we were conceived in our mother's wombs. We receive our eternal soul. His dream is that we become saints, the best version of ourselves, if you will, the original masterpiece that he had in mind. And so we have to wash away the sin, this grime, all that stuff. And mortification really helps us to do that. So I think that's always been an image that sticks in my mind when it comes to
you
this.
mentioning judgment there with the Sistine Chapel. And it kind of makes me think of a comment that the priest at the parish that I go to gave recently, where he's like, at the end of the day, when we appear before God on Judgment Day, there are only two things that we're going to have with us: unconfessed sins and the good works that we've done. And, those two things, unconfessed sins and the good works that we've done. That's it. Those are the only two things we're bringing with us on Judgment Day. And I think, like, it's those small acts of mortification, not even that we're maybe for ourselves, but maybe that mortification involves doing something for someone else. Allows us to kind of be that person that God calls us to be, and we focus on the judgment in Advent, but it's always good to keep the end in mind. Like, where's the final destination that we're hoping to go to? Going to the Israelites in the wilderness, and the goal was the promised land. Well, Lent doesn't exist for its own sake. It's to equip us to get to heaven, um, and to join in that resurrected life,
Yeah.
with Jesus. So, um, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm just not thinking out loud, but
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And yeah, so let's just talk about the last two things really quickly: fasting and almsgiving. And this, the fasting piece is really amazing, especially when you think about. Here's the great scriptural example that I would bring up for this: the prodigal son. We all know very well Luke's account of the prodigal son, Jesus' parable. And when you think about, and you can find this, by the way, in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, the prodigal son, so to speak, was so busy enjoying the pleasures of this world that he never did reflect on the purpose of his life and where he was actually going, where he was going to end up. And it was only when he lost everything and he became hungry. Remember, he's sold himself out as a day laborer, and talk about non-kosher. He's feeding the pigs, and he's longing to eat what they're eating. The slop that they're eating, and it's only when he became hungry, he actually was experiencing physical hunger. That's when he really, the light bulb came on, and then he said, "Man, I got to go back to my father's house. There's food and enough to spare. What am I doing?" And he had this longing for the father's house. And that's what happens to us when we fast, when we exercise the spiritual discipline of fasting, especially during Lent. It helps us to rekindle a longing for the Father's home, and not just heaven, but also for the church, which is really essentially the home of the Father on earth. And hopefully it awakens that in other people as well, this longing for the church, the Catholic Church. And going back to Jesus' own temptation and fasting in the desert, what was it that Jesus said to the enemy, to Satan, when he was hungry? Satan's like, "Hey, if you can do anything, make these stones become bread, turn them into a loaf of bread." And Jesus said, "Man does not live on bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of God." And we realize this in particular when we are fasting, or at least we should. And Pope Francis talks about this all the time. He talks about this concept of fake fasting, as he called it. And this is when people kind of go through the motions. And we can do this with any aspect of the spiritual life. We can do this with our rosary, with the Mass. We kind of go through the motions, not paying attention in a very rote manner. The fasting has to be accompanied by prayer and serious reflection, because the whole point of it is to create space for interior silence and in the interior movement of God. We kind of remove this physical comfort and pleasure, if you will, for a little time, so that we can really kind of feast more on the Word of God interiorly. And St. Leo the Great said this, quote, "The merit of fasts does not consist merely in abstaining from food. There is no use in depriving the body of nourishment if the soul does not fast from iniquity and the tongue does not stop feasting on evil." End of quote. Wow. And you think about, again, social media, how many people are using their tongue to just feast on evil, unjust criticism. And not all criticism is unjust, but gossip, so many things. We can, if we're not fasting from evil deeds that deprive us of the life of the Spirit of God, what are we doing here? I mean, living for Christ is going to make us so much happier than all that stuff. So I think the idea of fasting, there's a real spiritual basis for this. And again, it always makes me think of the prodigal son and how his
that
hunger
was
made him want to return to the
pretty
house of the Father.
hard-hitting quote. I mean, yeah, like wow, I've never thought
That's a
about
hard
that, but
hitting
yeah,
quote.
as your tongue feasting
Yeah.
on slander and maliciousness and online
Mm.
conversations, and it may I mean, gosh, yeah, I'm giving up this food, but my
Yeah.
soul is still feasting on iniquity by, you know, whatever. It's like, wow, yeah, that's a hard hitting
Yeah.
one. That's good.
It is. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly lots we can improve on that front for sure. And let's talk about the last thing, which is almsgiving. And I want to focus not so much on monetary almsgiving, because another big theme of my friend Cardinal Collins, friend of the program, the real focus of his ministry was stewardship. Like if there's a theme for his ministry and what he wanted out of the Catholics under his charge is this idea of stewardship, having God say to us in the end, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's the hope, and that's what we're shooting for. But what do we actually have control over in terms of stewardship? Time, the time that we've been gifted with. We don't know how much is left in the tank. Time, talent, and treasure. And of course, there are physical resources, including cash money that we've been entrusted with, some a little, some a lot. But we all have these resources of varying degrees, time, talent, and treasure. And when it comes to, a lot of people talk about tithing and is it a biblical concept and stuff like that. I don't really want to get into that right now, but here's another great quote, Lucas. Pope St. Gregory the Great, he said that Lent is our tithe of time to God in the year. Because think about this, and tithing is this idea of giving 10% of your income. But he said that Lent is our tithe of time to the Lord Jesus Christ. And for all you accountants out there,
I was
40
just trying to do
days,
this in
and
my
I
head
know
as you
Lent is
said
not
that. I'm like,
exactly 40 days, it's a little bit more.
in a span of a year.
Yeah. Well, I've done the math for you. So you don't even have to pull out the calculator here or Google this. 40 days out of 365 days is 10.9%. So it's a little more than a tithe, strictly speaking, for all you accountants out there. But here's the thing. Whatever we really want to do in life, we do make the time for it. If we want to scroll on social media, we'll do it. If you want to watch the Super Bowl, you're going to make time for it. If you want to watch the Four Nations hockey tournament, you're going to make time for it. You just got to make it happen. If you really want something bad enough, you're going to do it. And the same is true with time for God. If you want to give time to God, whether it's a part of your day, the hours entrusted to you for prayer, daily prayer, trying to get to daily mass if possible, certainly Sunday mass, the obligation, the daily rosary, New Testament reading for 5 minutes a day, some spiritual reading maybe for 10 minutes. These are all sort of gifts of our time that we're giving to God. And it's usually, I think we can all think of the fact that the time that we give to God is repaid usually 100-fold. I mean, we get way more out of it than anything, and there's always a return on investment. It's a great way to invest our time. And the reason why I want to focus on time when it comes to time, talent, and treasure is because sometimes the hardest thing to do for us is to give our time. The easiest thing to do sometimes is to give our physical treasure, to give a few bucks, throw a few bucks in the offering plate. You don't necessarily feel it. Although Mother Teresa said, you got to give till you feel the pinch. That's how you know it's a sacrificial gift. But for some people, maybe 10% isn't enough. If you're a billionaire or a multimillionaire, you're not going to feel that necessarily. So that's a challenge. It's a challenge. But for most of us, the gift of time actually costs us more. We feel that pinch a little bit more. So this is something we can really focus on. And I think at the end of the day, time, talent, and treasure, and think about ways we can maybe use the gifts we've been given to serve the church or local parish. That's important as well. But I just really want to focus on the almsgiving of time to God too when we think about that this Lent.
It's it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I'm even trying to think, but when you wake up in the morning and it's like you immediately want to jump to start your day, you're starting to think about things, planning stuff, and just to have the discipline to give the 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, however long in the morning. It's easy to find time. It's easy to find things to do. It's difficult to sit still and just give time over. And especially, I feel like in the West, the mentality of just always wanting to feel productive, like I'm doing something. I have to be doing something. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. Are you a human? Are
Right,
you a human
right.
doing or a human
So
being?
yeah, maybe adoration is a good practice, with Lent. If it's not something. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Give some time, some of that time to God in adoration. Sign up for a holy hour. That's on a weekly basis. For perhaps that's a great thing to think about. And of course, always, it's a great chance to grow closer to Our Lady. Talking about somebody who lived the passion well. She stood at the foot of the cross and suffered in unimaginable ways as she watched her son die on the cross. And of course, we were also entrusted to her as her children on Calvary. And Jesus says, of course, to the Apostle John, the beloved disciple, who's kind of a stand in for all of us. We're all beloved disciples of Jesus. Woman, here is your son. Son, here is your mother. And so we were entrusted to Mary as her children at the foot of the cross. And she will also help us as her children to be close to her son, Jesus. And again, a point from St. Jose Maria in the Way, in point number 506. I've always loved this. Um, he said this: the Virgin of Sorrows, when you contemplate her, look into her heart. She is a mother with two sons face to
Mm,
face, he and you. I really like that. This idea that she's trying to connect her children,
mm,
her son Jesus, who is divine, the divine Son of God, and you, and I need you guys to talk to each other. I need my children, if you will, to connect, and I'm going to intercede for that. I love that. So we need to spend time, a lot more time, getting to know our Lord face to face, and adoration is a perfect place to do that. So I think that's great. So there's just some stray thoughts on how we can try to make this
let's
Lent
do it.
the best one ever. Yeah, let's do it. Absolutely. So obviously we're just getting going with Lent, but hopefully this episode has been helpful to you. Why not share it with a friend? You can use the share tools on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify if you're listening using those services, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can also share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe. Please go to caleclark.com, CALE Clark with an E.com, and you can sign up for the email newsletter. Really, really important. I can be able to keep in touch with you about stuff that's happening. And by the way, I can make a little announcement here. I am planning a pilgrimage for this Jubilee year for November. It's going to be early November. Rome is in play, some other places I'm going to keep secret for now, but I'll have some more details on this pilgrimage for you really, really soon. So if you're interested in joining me in Rome and elsewhere, and I can't wait to reveal the next part of it, but I will soon, hopefully in the next episode, do go to my website, caleclark.com, sign up for the email list, or you can email me directly, kale@caleclark.com, and put in the subject line pilgrimage, just so I know for sure that you're interested in that, or just reply to the newsletter when you get it with the word pilgrimage in the subject line. And I'll make sure that you do get that news when it comes out really, really soon. So something to keep an eye on there. If you missed the Sahil Bloom interview, New York Times bestselling author, I interviewed him in New York City recently before his wonderful bestselling book, The 5 Types of Wealth, came out. And like I said, it's been a bestseller for 3 weeks now on the New York Times list. And it's number 2 in all of Amazon. So definitely go to watch that video and you can check that out. You can check the audio version of the interview as well. Share that with a friend too. Follow me on X, on social media, at Cale Clark, CALE Clark with an E. And it's so, so good to be with you. Have a very, very happy and most importantly, holy Lent. And hopefully this episode will help you do that. We'll catch you in the next one. Signing off for producer Lucas Holt. This is Cale Clark. Take care. Peace.